Alrighty, so it's top of the hour now. We're getting ready to start. Two more people joining the room, it looks like, but we're going to get started anyway. So here we go today. We're talking about building your cyber workforce to stop tomorrow's threats. Hot topic for today's industry. So I am your host today. I am Philip Casisa. I am the Director of Product Management here at Focal Point. Relatively recent addition to the team. I come from ISC Squared, the Association for Information Security Professionals, was there over a decade. So a lot of insight into information security professionals, how they develop and how they benefit your team. So also led IT and security while I was there, pretty high-end, pretty high-intensity position, as most of you probably know. So with me today, I have Julian Smith and Buffy Ellis, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Buffy, would you like to start, please?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Phil. I'm Buffy Ellis, as Phil said. I'm the Vice President of Training here at Focal Point, and I've been involved with IT security, and specifically training and development since the early 1990s. Over my career, I've seen lots of changes in technology, in tools, and techniques, but the one thing that has remained constant across my career is the challenge there is in finding and retaining qualified personnel. It's still, frankly, one of the biggest challenges employers and organizations face, and that's one of the things that we'd like to address and discuss today. Julian?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Julian Smith. As Phil said, I'm the Director of Education here at Focal Point. My background is in sort of cyber defense and analysis from a government perspective and cyber operations. I worked for almost a decade with both the British and US governments in those spaces, and then transitioned to instructing a few years ago, and then gradually progressed into the director's position, guiding curriculum and just seeing where the industry is really going, where the skills needs are, and obviously finding the right people to train your people.
Great. And so those are going to be our speakers today. First of all, you should know that you have a GoToWebinar dashboard on the side of your screen. You can use that to ask questions throughout the webinar. Just drop them into the questions section of the dashboard. Our presentation today should run about 30 to 40 minutes. We'll follow that up with whatever time we have left, whether it's 15 minutes or more for QA. If you have specific questions about what we're talking about today, we're happy to take those conversations offline as well. And off we go. So the big questions we're going to talk about today: what are we up against? A brief state of the industry. We're going to talk about some of the threat landscape, look at probably the well-documented workforce shortage. We're going to talk about the skills you need to combat those threats, and then how do we build a pipeline of those skills. So those are the topics we're going to tackle. And first of all, we'll get right into the threat landscape. So for those of you that are in security, you probably are very familiar with the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. It comes out every year in the February to April timeframe. And it gives us a really good insight as to what sort of attacks the industry as a whole is weathering and what sort of threats we're facing. So as we see the data here, we notice that, you know, most of the attacks are the outsiders. Certainly we have to worry about people on the inside as well. We notice that state-sponsored attacks, the nation states, are up and moving, and organized crime is a key player with 51% of attacks. So lots of insights here. Definitely recommend, if you haven't seen this report, to take a look at it. But we know that there's a lot of different attack vectors. We talk about hacking, we talk about malware, ransomware, a lot of weakness in stolen passwords, the social attacks. And we notice that a lot of the attacks are increasing in frequency, especially what we call social attacks on people. So all of that leads to a lot of pressure on security teams to perform. And so Buffy and Julian, any other insights you'd like to provide on the threat landscape before we jump on to the next slide?
Sure. I think, we could obviously spend all day talking about this and breaking down the various types of threats that are out there. I think the single most telling thing for me on this slide is the highest statistic anywhere on here is that of weak and stolen passwords contributing, to 81% of attacks or incidents. And of course, that's a human factor, whether it's somebody being lazy, not changing a default password, not setting a strong password, not changing their password frequently enough, being careless with how they manage them, password reuse across different sites and services, all of that kind of thing. That's all a human factor. And so I think it just draws us immediately to, we're talking about an industry here and a situation that is built on technology, but it's absolutely driven by people. And that's what we see time and again. That's exactly why we're here talking about people.
I think I would add to that, Phil, that I've seen these reports for more years than I would like to admit, and even though the specific vectors change, meaning the specific pieces of malware or the specific spyware that steals your password, overall, the types of attacks remain consistent. And it leads me to wonder, and it leads many people to wonder, what are we doing right versus what are we doing wrong? Obviously, many organizations have invested in training, especially user awareness in the last 10 years. But despite our efforts, we still see, as Julian pointed out, the human factor being our weakest area and resulting in these types of compromises. So we really have to question, what could we do differently to reduce these numbers? Because to me, despite the vectors changing, the overall percentages and types of attacks remain consistent.
Absolutely. And certainly we're going to jump into why do some of these attacks persist, and we're going to talk about now. Next slide. The workforce shortage itself. So a number of different studies tackle this state of the workforce, situation. A lot of them try to look at how big is the workforce, how skilled is the workforce, how are people reporting their teams performing? Are they understaffed? Are they overworked? How hard is it to hire and retain personnel to man these elite security teams? Because if we're going to have users with weak passwords, those users are going to lead to breaches. Breaches are going to lead to embarrassing situations for the organizations that employ these security teams. And so, how are we going to find the workers to continue to fill these gaps? And so, I know we have some stories to tell here. Julian, what can you tell me about the workforce shortage and your interpretation of it?
That's a good question. So, I mean, I think these numbers have been banding around for a while, right? There was I think the first report that really drew attention to them was a Cisco report in, I want to say 2015, that estimated at the time a 1 million person shortfall in cybersecurity positions. So whatever the numbers that really are, they're huge and they're growing, right? We're actually going in the wrong direction at the moment, and so I think the picture that I see at the moment is that the number of high-profile breaches that have occurred over the last 3-4 years have really woken up the industry to the nature and just the scale of the threat that's posed by cyber and how it's a very real thing. We're sometimes misled, I think, by terms like cyberspace, which kind of gives us this idea that it's often some alternate reality that we maybe don't need to worry about so keenly. But you only need to read the news headlines. I mean, look at the Equifax breach that is unraveling at the moment, just to see how real world this is and how crucial. And it seems to me that industry has certainly woken up to the scale of the threat, but not necessarily the scale of the investment that's needed in order to really be protected. And we've certainly seen some commercial clients who have really taken that initiative and said, yeah, we're going to do our best not to fall foul to this, and making significant investments. But I think across industry, there's still a catch up going on there. And of course, with it being such a sparse market in terms of the available workforce, that makes it harder. It makes it less appealing, or less, it's a bigger investment in terms of time and effort, as well as just the finance, in order to pull together a proper cybersecurity function in any given industry.
Absolutely. So I'll add into what Julian said for Equifax in particular. I had a friend who was talking about this breach, and she said, I went straight to Equifax's site, looked at the careers, and found 18 security operations jobs available at that company at the time that they announced the breach. So these are jobs that could have helped prevent that particular incident, or at least could have done something more than having them empty, and could have done something with that. So I definitely think that there's something to be said here about a workforce shortage, and certainly how do we address such a shortage? And if there is going to be one, it doesn't mean that, okay, the bad guys acknowledge that we have a shortage and that our teams are overworked and they'll take it easy on us. It's really quite the opposite. They're looking for sort of where weaknesses are and how to exploit them. And if your teams are under overworked, or you don't have enough people on your team, or you're going to leave vulnerabilities out there that undetected, they'll detect them for you, and they'll use them to their advantage.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Phil. I kind of want to add to what you guys have already contributed in this conversation, that we also are facing an attrition problem as well as kind of just a gap or opening in the number of positions. So we see, you have a challenge recruiting, but you also have the challenge of retaining. The last time I looked at the Department of Labor and Statistics, they gave a number in the low 40s in terms of cyber job attrition rates. And I found that appalling, and it really led me to question, what do you need to have in place as an employer that once you've, overcome the hurdle of finding and hiring a qualified cyber professional, how do you keep them? How do you retain them and build their skill sets so that they can grow and have a career within your organization and contribute to your organization in terms of a cohesive cyber team? The second thing that it kind of led me to think about is, what are the skill sets? What are the qualities that really make someone successful in a cybersecurity program? And Julian and I have had a lot of conversations about that as we recruit personally for our own teams. And we came up with a short list of qualities, and they don't necessarily directly correlate to cyber experience or certifications. It's more of personality type and specific qualities. So we look for people who are adaptive, meaning they're comfortable with change. One of the things I encountered personally as a trainer years ago is this resistance to change, and that's a normal human quality. But in our industry, we have to accept that change is, in some cases, a daily or hourly exercise. We have to be willing to throw away the skill sets that we acquired years ago and bring in or acquire new ones. We also have to have an affinity for that process, a desire to learn, a desire to grow, a desire to be involved in the industry. And I think probably the biggest thing we look for is someone who has an affinity for problem solving. And we've found people in various fields that don't seem to relate to cyber at all. People that have worked in music or musicians, mathematicians, even folks that worked in the postal system, but they had a strong affinity for problem solving. They like to face the challenge of getting to an answer or a solution and won't quit until they do. Julian, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I would definitely amplify that and say that the character qualities, that sort of, or they're just the personal traits that you're looking for are at least as important as the technical abilities, because they're much harder to instill in someone if they're not there already. I think that problem-solving ability is absolutely crucial, and I think one other characteristic that that is maybe a surprising thing to hear, but that I think is equally crucial, is just that of humility, because it's the people who think they're rock stars that are going to trip themselves up, in their own magnificence. The reality is that if I was reading a report just yesterday, I think, that categorized organizations in two ways. It said there are those that have been breached and know it, and then those that have been breached, which it brought a wry smile to my face. and what it emphasized to me is that we have to accept the fact that we're all going to have to deal with a situation that we don't want to. No one can put themselves out there and say, well, we won't get hacked, we'll be fine. And there's I won't name them, but there's a well-known manufacturer of security appliances that likes to advertise in that way and say that basically they've solved the problem for you, and they've been hacked, through their own devices, through techniques like SQL injection. So you just end up with, if you set out with that kind of mindset, like it's not going to happen to us, you just end up with egg on your face ultimately, and that ability, that desire to unravel the problems, to not turn a blind eye, to look under every stone, and then to obviously be constantly adaptable and teachable to new techniques and things is absolutely crucial.
Well,
That's a great segue here. Go ahead, Buffy.
Oh, I'm sorry. I couldn't agree more. In fact, one of the questions that I love to ask myself, and I encourage our folks to ask, is what don't I know? What am I not seeing? Right. And there's a certain humility kind of implied in that. You have to be willing to say, hey, I don't know everything, and there's still something that I need to be open to learn.
And so that brings us to our next slide, where we see here the threats. We've identified these threats. These are the things that are attacking every single day, according to the the Verizon Data Breach Report. It happens. I hear it anecdotally from my friends in the industry. So let's answer these two questions here for security leaders and for practitioners. I mean, how do you know that your skills? How do you know what skills you need to have on your team? And if you're a practitioner, what do I need to know to continue to advance in my industry and deliver the right service to my employer?
It's interesting. Julian and I were actually having this conversation earlier today. Obviously this is to a certain degree organizationally specific, but overall, as a security leader, you need to ask yourself, what problem or problems do my team need to be able to solve? And that kind of informs your overall structure and allows you to differentiate roles that are going to be able to address the individual areas to solve a bigger problem. And Julian, do you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, I think that's absolutely the place to start. There's definitely a difficulty for leaders in particular, because there is just frankly a sort of a lack of maturity still in the industry, right? In the cybersecurity industry, there aren't enough seasoned professionals who have multiple years of experience and worked their way through the ranks to a position of leadership at this point, to be able to just sit there and figure this all out in one go, and look at a list of threats like this and just put the pieces in place to mitigate those threats. It definitely has to start with, okay, what is my organization doing? What are the outcomes that I need to achieve? And there's always a risk decision cycle, right? There are risks that we have to accept in an organization, and then find some way to monitor them in case they elevate. There are ways to transfer risk out of an organization, and there are ways to directly mitigate risks. And you have to be able to start with, what am I trying to achieve? What is the implication if my customer database is breached and all of the details are pillaged from it? What does that do to my business? Obviously, that's not good. But the exercises like that are exactly where to start. What do I need to achieve?
That's fantastic. So the next slide, we're talking about now the NICE security framework. And, Julian, we'll go right back to you on this one. Tell me, what is the NICE security framework and why does it matter to me and my organization?
Sure. So NICE is the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. It's an initiative that has been sort of facilitated and run out of NIST, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology. So you can go look up all of this if you wanted to on your own at nist.gov/NICE. And that will give you access to the whole framework and how to use it. But basically, this is a collaboration between government, academia, and industry to pool a bunch of things together. One is to establish conventions, nomenclature, definitions across the industry. What do we mean by these things? And then within various categories, there are 7 categories to the framework, and they're things like operate and maintain, securely provision, protect and defend, analyze, oversee and govern. I'm trying to think of the ones I've forgotten. Investigate and collect and operate is the last one. And so these are these functions, like we were saying just now. You know, what do I need? What are my objectives? What do I need to do? Well, to some measure, organizations need to be able to do some of all of those things. So within a category, there are then specialty areas that might dictate what what kind of areas of work exist within, say, securely provision, for example. So that might mean systems architecture. Where do I get my infrastructure from and build things? It might mean software development. How do I build and deploy safe, robust software, all that kind of thing. So those are the specialty areas within those categories, and then this breaks down further into specific roles, and then at the very fine-grained version into what they call KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities, which are they're very specific items, things that need to be known or done by somebody who's in one of these roles. And the idea here is to provide a common standard. What are we all working towards? Because there is organizational nuance here. From you have to know your own organization's needs to be able to define a program and a good framework for your organization. But there is a lot of standardization across the piece here of, well, I know I've got operating systems I need to protect and keep patched and up to date. I've got networks that I need to defend. I need to build my infrastructure securely. I need to have some kind of reactive capability to when I discover, indicators of compromise in my network. There are common pieces that everyone needs to some extent or needs access to. If you're a small company and you don't have, the ability to bring this in-house, then to make sure that you've actually got an established relationship with with an outside party you can go to when you need them, that kind of thing. So it's really designed to just enable workforce development by defining all of the various aspects of the workforce. And we have clients who map directly to this framework. It's not a panacea, right? It's not the be all and end all of cybersecurity, but we have clients certainly who use this framework very specifically, and they take it and apply it to their own organization, identify the pieces that apply to them, and then they can use that as the basis to build a program. What do I have in my people already? What do I need? And what are the gaps? And I think that's what we're kind of rolling onto next, right?
Awesome.
Sure. And if I could just add, going back to what we were saying previously, as an organization, you don't necessarily have to have all of these roles. It's helpful to understand what roles are required to perform certain functions or have certain functions internally. But this also goes back to the risk decision Julian was referring to earlier. You may choose to mitigate that risk by outsourcing those responsibilities and roles. And that's where organizations like managed service providers come in as partners to come alongside the small or medium-sized organization and serve to fulfill those roles without necessarily having to build that capability inside your organization.
That's great. And so we could talk a little bit right now about building an enterprise security team, and certainly understanding the roles, the knowledge, skills, and abilities that apply to those roles and how they work inside your organization is sort of the foundational elements to building this enterprise security team. So Buffy, right back to you. Tell me about what we're looking at here in this diagram and how we transition from, once we've taken a look at our program, we have been identified and we've defined our skills, how do we go through the assessment and then develop the plan and then implement this training program necessary to create the talent pipelines that we need to be able to staff our security teams?
Sure. So, assuming that each organization has some semblance of internal security team, whether it's a fully functional SOC with differentiated roles and levels of progression within those roles, or it's an organization that's just starting to define their program, the first step is to figure out what problems they need to solve. And that then allows you to define the roles that you have within your organization and the individual KSAs for each one of those roles. Once you've taken each one of those steps, you now have kind of your list of measure, what do I need to achieve to be fully functional as a team? Your next step is to figure out, who do I have and how do they stack up against that measure? Which of these knowledge, skills, and abilities do they currently have, and where are their gaps? And that's typically done through testing of two types. One is a knowledge-based test. So that's like we've all seen, it's multiple choice, it's drag and drop, where you're asking them to apply the information in their head to solve a problem and give you a concrete answer. But we also need to test their ability, and that really lends to some kind of challenge or lab-based exercise, whether it's a capture the flag, whether it's a lab environment where we ask them to solve a problem. In most of our courses, we use some kind of challenge environment. For our traffic analysis classes, it's in an enormous PCAP where we're asking people to find and attribute certain behaviors within that traffic. But it's through that combination of knowledge and hands-on testing, you get a gauge of where your people are. And probably that's one of the most crucial pieces of information. Even if it's to tell you you're not where you think you are, it's very, very useful to know where you're starting from, because only once you know where you're starting from do you know where you need to go. So once you have that baseline of where do my gaps lie, what are my people capable of, and what do they have as an opportunity for growth, shall we say. Once we have that, we can then develop a plan. And that plan should be individualized, meaning each person will have a path of knowledge and skills they need to grow. But it also should be within the context of the team, because we're expecting them to be able to do both, right? That an individual should accomplish their role tasks, but the team needs to work together to solve a larger problem. And once we enter into that process and we develop a plan, we really then see an iterative cycle where each individual is acquiring new knowledge, skills, and ability. We then assess those knowledge, skills, and abilities and then ask them to apply them together as a team and validate that that team can solve the problem we need them to solve. Julian, do you want to add to that?
That was pretty comprehensive. Well, actually, no. I think there's more to say about this, right? So I think I'll just hold off for now, unless you want to talk about this cycle, the implementation cycle, a bit more. Well, okay. Yeah. We should focus on that, because that's very crucial. So I think you really hit the nail on the head with this. You've got individual, you need an assessment of your workforce. There's individual development that needs to happen, but then there's also a team level validation that needs to happen. There's multiple levels. There's no such thing as the superhero in this situation who's going to solve all of your problems. So building a program where each piece is being gradually brought up to the place where it needs to be, and then the whole team is being assessed and validated as well on a sort of a second level is absolutely crucial. And in particular, the way they interact. I mean, that's something we've emphasized a lot in our training historically, the nature of team-based work and exercise and training, and making sure that you don't have somebody who's off over here in left field doing their own thing, and they may have done something, they might have found out something really useful and really crucial, and if they don't know how to share it properly, or if another member of the team doesn't understand it correctly, doesn't understand the significance of it, then you lose it. So I think that's really crucial, the strength of the team as opposed to just the strength of the individual.
Yes, well said. Yeah, you need to have those differentiated roles, but they have to know when to hand off to each other, and they have to know what's significant in another team member's findings and when they need to hand it off and work together to solve a multifaceted problem. Because let's face it, the cyber attacks we see today are multifaceted and often over long periods of time. So it's correlating all those indicators, it's understanding each person's role within the team and how to work collectively.
And just on that topic, I see a question in here that says, I'm trying to build up my security team from a fairly small group. Any tips on prioritizing which positions to hire for first? That's a great question. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a stock answer, but there are questions you can ask yourself to try and get yourself to the answer. So, obviously, if you're seeing repeated problems, then repeated incidents, or whether it's intrusions, policy violations, whatever else, then those are things to address as a priority, whatever's most likely to have an impact on your business. If you don't know what those things are, then you need to take a step back from that and say, well, do I actually have a system here where I'll even detect those things? Do I need somebody who's a good network engineer who can architect the network better, who can position intrusion detection sensors better, so that I can see and know how to configure those things, so I can actually see what's going on and I know what the problems are. So it really depends what stage you're at to be able to answer that question effectively. I know that's not a particularly helpful answer, but it all goes back to these functional requirements. What am I trying to achieve as an organization? And if I don't know specifically what I need to do in a cybersecurity context, then I need to work out, well, how do I find out what the problems are?
Yeah, I think we're happy to consult on that too. I mean, if that's something that's facing your individual organization, we're happy to take that offline and consult with you to figure out the right approach. So happy to do that. And kind of just jump into the next one now. Workforce training. So how do you build the pathways for your team? How do you build their skills? How do you advance them in their careers, either within the organization or just aligning? So Buffy, you mentioned earlier about just the really poor attrition rate. So in an organization that has a workforce training program or is known for a workforce training program, that should have a positive impact on attrition, right? I mean, people should want to stay there and learn to become the best that they can before they either blossom with their career within that same organization or ultimately move on. But tell me about what the impacts are there.
Sure. There are many impacts. I think probably one of the biggest ones from the perspective of an employee in an organization that does have a workforce training program is the ability to have input and co-ownership of their career. And that may not seem like a big deal, but for most IT and cybersecurity professionals, classically, they have to own their own career. So they look at, the statistical openings, what jobs are out there. Then they look at the salary ranges and they say, okay, that job sounds cool and it pays a lot. I'm going to go get these certs or this knowledge and go find that job. And that leaves them then jumping from position to position every 2 to 3 years as they work to progress their own career. But if the employer partners with the employee and creates a clearly defined path or sets of paths where in partnership with the employee, they say, here's where you are, but here are all the places you can go within our organization, and even allow you to kind of intern in those different positions. Take a day or two to shadow a mentor in the various roles and say, is this a role that suits my skill set? And if so, then I have a clearly defined path. How do I get there? What kinds of courses do I need to take? What kinds of skills do I need to develop? What kinds of tests do I need to pass? And what's the payoff? Can I become an apprentice and then a journeyman in this area? Can I become a tier 2 or tier 3? Can I become a manager or even a vice president if I pursue this path? And it really creates, like I said, a partnership, and it changes the dynamic between the employer and the employee to one of partnership versus, I wouldn't say animosity, but maybe there's a little bit of competition out there, obviously, in the cyber field. So
just a little bit,
yeah, just a tiny bit.
So Julian, tell me about the courses we're looking at here, and as this is just an example pathway for network training. So what type of role would this be good for? And tell me about how the progression works.
Sure. So this is set of courses, and I'd caveat all of this by, as Phil said, this is kind of an example. We use, it's more of a framework, right, than a menu. That's the distinction I usually make. But this is our network threats track as it currently stands in its sort of standardized form, and it starts off with learning this first network traffic analysis course, learning how to actually understand what's going on your network. So you've built a network, you've configured a network, you think you know what it's doing. This is taking you to the, okay, is what's flowing around my network actually what I think? Can I attribute certain behaviors? You know, what's normal on this network? What's abnormal? What do I need to pay attention to? How do I attribute, if I find some kind of suspect behavior, how do I attribute that to, you know, if it's within my network, maybe to a person? How do I attribute it to an outside entity, and what is that entity if it's come from the outside? And then moving along this track, I won't dwell on each of these. I mean, I could obviously talk for a long time about what's in each of these, and I don't want to bore you to tears. But the progression here is, you know, learning some Python skills, right, and with a particular emphasis on network defense. What are some skills that I can pick up that will allow me to automate, you know, regular, perhaps tedious processes that need doing, you know, as I get gradually more expert. So how can I make myself sharper and more efficient and leave more time to, you know, to focus on the really important things? The malicious network traffic analysis then takes that obviously to a next level, looking very specifically at different kind of attack vectors, different types of attacks. We try very much in principle in our curriculum to stick with the idea of you know, teaching somebody how to drive, not teaching them the controls of a specific vehicle. So tools might change, specific attacks might change, but if you have general skills, methodologies, approaches that you can take, and you're equipped through this, you know, with the ability to be able to go research things that you don't yet know about, then that sets you up in a really good, you know, a really good place. A lot of this comes down to in this course comes down to maybe statistical analysis, right? So you're not actually, you know, picking through packets of network traffic one at a time. One of the mantras we like to throw out, it's scrolling is not an analytic method, right? If you've got a huge traffic capture from your network, you're not just going to go scroll through it to see what happened. You'll be there, you know, all year. But this is teaching you how to find those various types of attacks. What am I looking for? And then in the cyber threats course, we put that very much on the front foot, and that's focused a lot on intrusion detection and prevention systems. How do I, not just the mechanics of one of those systems, but how do I use one well? How do I configure it properly? Where do I put my sensors? What do I do? How do I write rules, well signatures for those systems, so that they'll run efficiently, so that I will minimize the number of false positives that I'm getting? And, you know, I can actually put my analytic effort where it's really needed. And the advanced class is kind of it's actually a little bit more off on a tangent. It sort of focuses a bit more at the WAN level, the wide area network level. So it's not so broadly applicable, but it's looking at the same sort of disciplines from, you know, say if you've got, it's certainly applicable if you've got a multi-campus network that you're dealing with, right? You've got significant infrastructure. How do I construct that? How do I understand what my routers are doing? If I've got, you know, say, something like MPLS running between sites, which is it's a technology that's often used to connect different campuses, speed up traffic and provide other capabilities. You know, how do I understand what's going on with that, whether it's working correctly, whether it has some kind of anomalies in it? So it's a gradual progression of from the very simple to the I'm dealing with some very advanced concepts and large amounts of data.
And if I could add, you know, where the content for each one of these courses came from, as Julian described them, is us looking at the end state. What kinds of roles are there? What kinds of challenges are there analytically to analyzing all of the alerts from intrusion detection and prevention devices, all of the captures that are done by those devices? What do I do with that content? And kind of reversing, well, what are the common attack vector types? What skill sets, what methodology would be effective to find those attack types? And that really informed the content of these tracks.
Excellent. So these are really high-end tracks. These are not basically your introduction to cybersecurity. These are not, you know, for the faint of heart. These are for really the people that are going to be in the trenches, your actual cyber defenders on the front lines, executing at a really high level. The more you progress down the track.
Oh, that's a good point, Phil. We would consider network traffic analysis as a course to be an entry-level course, but what we mean by that is an entry level into the track. But we do assume a certain level of knowledge base there, that the person entering that class would have a good handle on TCP/IP, on networking principles or concepts, and we're building on that and adding to that the analytic skill set and the cyber-specific knowledge and ability. So it's really ideal for somebody who has an IT background, for example, and wants to progress or become a cyber professional.
And I think that's a really good point. I mean, that's where if we're all looking for who's going to be on my cybersecurity team, you know, look at your IT staff. Who on that team is qualified to take that next step and maybe jump into a class and make a transition to cybersecurity? That's a perfectly not only legitimate, but a really a blast off point for those that are make that leap, and really for organizations to promote from within and build that talent as they go forward.
And don't forget on that you're looking for the people. You're not necessarily looking for the most technically advanced people. You're looking for those who have the right hunger, the right inquisitive brain, right? The people who aren't happy just to sit and do the same tasks regularly each day, but always like to challenge. Well, why is this like that? Or can we improve? Those kind of people, the people who are looking to innovate in your IT department already, who are thinking, can we do this differently? Is there a reason we do it this particular way? They're asking those kind of questions. Those are the people that you want to grab and put into this kind of a track.
Yeah, problem solvers.
Yep, definitely. Yep.
So kind of our last sort of area of discussion, and I'll kick this off. I mean, just last night we had a mixer here in the Tampa area, and I was talking to one of our clients, and he said that he just lost someone from his team, someone that he had hired as an intern and had progressed, his skills through the years. He spent about 3 years inside the organization, and when he finally left, he was performing at a senior level. And so when they went to go hire, to fill that position, they recast it as a senior level position. And so since he had come through as an intern and basically worked his way up through the security hierarchy that they had in that organization, and built his skills and built his capabilities and had done some amazing things, he was still not, he was still making like money that you would expect to see in a sort of an entry-level security, high-level IT person. But when he goes to rehire somebody to say, okay, I'm going to recast this position now as a senior position, the people that are applying for that job and are trying to fill those skills are costing twice as much. And so now, because he hadn't had a pipeline of people behind him, before he hadn't brought in a new intern and trained them through the process and almost been ready to backfill this position, he's almost in a position now where he either has to basically forego the skills for a few years while he builds somebody, or he has to basically pay market rate for someone to fill the role. And that's a really tough position to be in. Having the workforce development program certainly keeps you into a space where we have a team, but we always expect that team, like elements of that team, to change roles, whether they get promoted and somebody needs to do the position, whether they move on and need to do the position. We need to have people that are ready to do the work and to do, especially when it comes to stopping the threats that we've talked about earlier. So I think it's really important to sort of at least have an idea what your roles are, how we're going to develop people, where they're going to come from, and do it in a way that's cost effective. Because if we're going to hire for each individual role, and then we're going to hire people based on their experience, and we're going to hire senior people, it's one way to do it, but you'll have a hard time finding all of those people, and it's going to make the program itself less affordable over time. So I know Julian and Buffett, you have some opinions on this too. I want to hear what your thoughts are.
Sure. I was going to defer to Buffy to start us off if you want to.
Sure. Well, it's interesting, Phil, you were touching on what I would call or characterize the cost of attrition, which is one of the biggest things facing employers in the cybersecurity space, right? We talked about 40+% attrition, and in effect, the gentleman you were speaking to at that mixer had created an asset, that was far more valuable than the position and the salary seemed to indicate, and that was validated when that person left, and they left a hole that was a senior level hole versus an entry level, and without that backfill, as you said, you have a lot of work to do ahead of you. You either going to that work is going to come in terms of increased salary, or that work is going to come in terms of trying to train a replacement. That's not uncommon in the cybersecurity field, and that's one of the reasons why we like to see a formalized workforce development program. Because in a formalized program, you have a flow, you have people constantly coming into that program and being developed, and you have the people that are at the top of that program who now own their career, are the senior level staff, and more importantly, you're creating multiple mentors so that those junior people that come in can work alongside that seasoned professional. So instead of the head of the team being the only mentor, you're creating that system internally and have the ability to continually train new people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's one of the crucial things, isn't it? Is actually that building of a culture and a system. It's not just oh, here's my security guy, or here's my it's actually it's a significant investment, and it's an investment that organizations didn't need to make 20 years ago. But on the flip side, it's an investment in something that allows you to be a lot more productive as an organization. The ability to better harness technology that is now available can make an organization massively more productive, but also exposes it to risk. So the investment in enabling that, I mean, I think that's actually a word we use quite frequently when we're talking about these kind of programs. It's not so much like a protection program as an enablement program, right? You're enabling a business or an organization to run in a way that harnesses the power of the technology that's around us, but do so in a way where you've mitigated risks to the level that you're expecting to, or that you're planning to. And it has to be a sort of a cultural shift almost, that a piece of the organization that people want to be involved with, and not sort of just the thing that happens behind closed doors that most people want to just ignore and not be involved with.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that, if we go back to that previous slide, which you don't need to go backwards, but when we talked about the assessment and validation piece that's part of a workforce development program, the reason that's so important, as an organization, if I have a cybersecurity team or a security operations center, and I have 20 people, without a formalized program that includes assessing their current capability and a program of development and validation, meaning can they solve the problems we believe that they will face, then I don't have a clear picture of what my capability truly is. And with the workforce development program, not only do I get that clear picture, but I'm able to gauge actual readiness. And that's extremely important when it comes to mitigating risk, as Julian mentioned.
Great, and thank you everybody who have gotten questions into this point. There still is, we have one slide left, and there still is time to get your questions in. We will only have a few minutes at the end of this to go over them. So now we're going to talk a little bit about network traffic analysis. This is the class we mentioned earlier as part of the sample track we lit. So we have a relationship here. So thank you for those of you that are joining that were invitees of Tech 2000. So we have a partnership with them, and we are bringing a open enrollment class to the Atlanta area in November. This is a 5-day full class. Again, we talked about this being the sort of an entry-level class for those with at least a slight technological background that could handle some of the prerequisites. I'll let Julian talk a little bit more about the details here for this, just on top of what we've already said. But this is a great opportunity to get the team built up to enhance the skills of especially of those that are working incident detection inside your organizations and really combating those threats on the front lines. And so, Julian, please, if you would, just give us just a little bit more detail as to who should be there and what they're going to learn.
Sure. So I'll try and stay out of the details really, but just to give you a bit of a fuller picture, I think this course is, as I mentioned before, it's geared towards understanding what's actually going on in your network versus what you expect is happening or what you think is happening. So learning how to baseline normal behavior and therefore how to detect abnormal behavior, whether that's caused by malicious activity or whether it's just caused by misconfiguration of a piece of equipment, whatever those things are. Learning how to attribute and track activity to reconstruct an event timeline of events that have gone on within your network. The capstone exercise for this course in particular is a team-based capture the flag exercise with various kind of categories and challenges, and the last of which, the special, the secret challenge that you have to unlock as a team is following it's a SCADA attack, an industrial control system attack against a power plant, and just following this flow of traffic from what people often refer to as chatter in the first place, talk of something happening, to actual communications methods being used between these various entities, to an actual breach into the power plant systems, and then manipulation of PLCs, programmable logic controllers, things that control actual industrial equipment. So that's the sort of level we're trying to build people up to in this, to be able to say, okay, I've got this breadcrumb, this starting point, and I'm going to go and follow the trail and see where it takes me. Or perhaps I don't even have the breadcrumb. Perhaps I just know I should be looking in my network to make sure everything's as I expect it to be. What do I do? How do I look? Where do I start on that? If I don't have a starting point, particular, I don't have, say, some kind of alert that I'm responding to. How should I be looking at data? So it's a very broad, there are a lot of different bits of skill set baked into this course. It's pretty it's sort of pretty intense really, because there's, like I said, lots of different things going on, and they all come together in a sort of a rounded skill set, allowing someone who's maybe, as Buffy mentioned earlier, maybe they already understand TCP/IP networking to some extent. They understand the fundamentals of networking, how routers and switches operate, things like that. But this is taking them to a security analyst level of being able to figure out what's actually going on here and how do I trace it.
That's great. So there's more info available. There's a link at the bottom of this slide to Tech 2000's site to get a little bit more detail and to register interest with them. Of course, we are available to answer a few questions. Let's see here. What have we not answered already? I guess we'll throw this one out to the panel. We've heard a lot about ransomware this year and scrambled to prepare for it. Any ideas what next year's big security threat will be?
That's an interesting question. Julian, were you going to say something?
I was. What I was going to say is actually it almost doesn't matter. It's probably not going to be Flash because the major browsers are phasing out support for Flash. It's really the particular technology and attack. It really depends. Things change over time. We've seen things like document embedded malware, so things put into a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet. We've seen the rise and fall and rise again of those types of attacks, right? People being emailed. Certain parts of an organization are much more susceptible to that, like, for example, HR and finance, because they're used to receiving those kind of documents from external entities a lot more, right? So that you tend to get a much higher number of successful attacks in that way. But it really depends on how the base technology evolves. I'd say it's pretty much impossible to predict, but the same sort of features will persist. That ability to exploit human weakness or error of judgment, and certainly to exploit default configurations that haven't been changed. That seems like that's never going to go away, unfortunately. Buffy, what were you gonna?
Well, I was just gonna return full circle to the conversation we had at the very beginning, which is when we look at the threat landscape, ransomware, for example, or document embedded malware, all are going at your weakest point, which is the human being. The human being has to click on the malicious download from the website, right, that installs the ransomware, or the human being needs to open that document with the embedded malware. And overall, we call that class of attack social engineering, trying to get the human to do something that enables or proliferates an attack. And I think no matter what the threat is next year or the year after, they always target your weakest point.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. We got one more question here that we'll be able to work in. I'm a penetration tester with over 2 years experience. How will a potential employer assess my skills?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because I think the sort of blunt answer to that at the moment is a lot of them don't know how to. Right, that's part of the problem for employers, not knowing what it is that what skills they need in-house, and therefore how they should assess those skills. That's where things like that NICE framework that we touched on briefly earlier become so crucial, because if you don't have this expertise in-house, how do you get it? How do you learn to assess and validate somebody's skills? So I mean, it really obviously depends on who the employer is. What we would like to see employers do, certainly, is to have both. As Buffy mentioned, we use both knowledge-based testing and actual validation labs and exercises in our training, and so we definitely encourage employers to use both of those, right? To use a test. I mean, and maybe that is to look for, say, a certification, right? Something that implies a level of knowledge and understanding, but then to layer on top of that, well, okay, here is an exercise that we need you to be able to work through, and actually see how the candidate performs. I mean, that's what really needs to be happening. It's what happens across a lot of other industries.
Right. I would totally agree with you, Julian. I'm going to tell a brief story that relates to the past. For those of you that were around in IT before it became IT security and then cybersecurity, you'll remember the prevalence of people like MCSEs back in the 90s. And there was a point at which there were only a few MCSEs, so just getting your certification was enough of a qualification to get a job. But then there was this huge glut in the marketplace of folks that invested the time and money to go get that certification. And employers quickly realized there were people that had the certification and the capability, and people that just had the certification. And that really started a trend that continues today, where if I'm hiring for a really technical position, I'm going to ask you to do something to demonstrate your ability, whether it's work through a lab, whether it's solve a technical problem, whether it's to debug a section of code, as it pertains to the position. So when you look at pen testing, you might be asked to demonstrate proficiency with Kali. You may be asked to demonstrate proficiency with various pen testing tools, and you get that more hands-on type job interview now than you're used to in the past.
And it looks like that's all the time we have. We are right at the top of the 2 o'clock hour here on the East Coast. So thank you for joining us today. We will have looks like a few questions didn't get answered. Hopefully we will be able to queue those up and put together a written response that will let some of our people know about, those that are attending this webinar. And we'll get those up on a blog or something for you shortly. In the meantime, thank you for participating, and I hope this was educational for you as it was for us. Please reach out to Tech 2000 to inquire about the network traffic analysis course coming in November, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.